So today we're going to be making banh mi sandwiches, which is a Vietnamese sandwich that's usually made with baguette bread. And there are a whole wide range of ingredients that are put inside these things. There's a bunch of different kinds of meats, pickled daikon and carrots, there are other vegetables, jalapenos, cilantro. There are all kinds of things that are put inside these sandwiches. I'm going to be doing grilled pork banh mi sandwiches, and I will say if you've never had a banh mi sandwich, find a Vietnamese restaurant near you and go get one. It's not like stop watching this video level of urgency, but it's like immediately after this video level of urgency. You should go get one of these things if you haven't had one. You'll thank me afterwards. It's one of the best sandwiches in the world, so let's make these things. So we're gonna start things off by getting our meat ready, and we're gonna be making Char Siu, or Chinese BBQ Pork, which is from the Cantonese region in southeast China. And for that, we're gonna need this stuff, fermented red bean curd. And if you've ever had that reddish colored pork at your local Chinese restaurant, open the jar of this stuff and you'll recognize the scent immediately as the primary flavoring component in that dish. For the marinade, I'm going to start with 8 curds from the jar, and before proceeding with the remaining ingredients, I'm going to use a fork to break them down into a paste. These are harder to break apart once you start adding other ingredients, so it's best to get that out of the way from the start. Then we're going to work in 2 tablespoons or 1 ounce of the reserve liquid from the jar, and combine that with 1.5 ounces each of Chinese cooking wine, hoisin sauce, soy sauce, and sugar, and finally 2 teaspoons of 5-spice powder. Give the whole thing a good whisking, and let's go over a few meat options. So for the meat today, I'm going to be using these things, country style spare ribs, which is just pork shoulder that's been sliced down into thick slices. And what I like about these things is that they have a good amount of meat and fat on them. So on the grill, the fat's going to render out and things are going to caramelize up really well, and it's going to have a really good flavor. Another thing I like about these things is that they're generally pretty cheap, but there are a lot of other cuts that could also be used in this dish. Like pork belly works really well on this dish. You could use the entire pork shoulder and just shred it up like you would for pulled pork, but those things do take a lot longer to cook than what these things take. You could use chicken, but if you were to use chicken, I would stay away from chicken breasts because they dry out very easily, so I would use maybe leg quarters or thighs for that. Okay, rather than just tossing the meat into the marinade as is, I'm going to season the outside with a bit of kosher salt. The marinade does have salt in it already, but it's not enough, and this is a good technique to use if you're unsure in your head about the salt balance within a marinade. And I'm just giving these things a light sprinkle here. I would say go with slightly less than what you would use if you weren't using the marinade. And another thing you want to look for with country style spare ribs are random bone fragments. They're pretty easy to find, and if you do find 1 or 2, now is a good time to cut them out. And when I'm shopping for these things, I do like to sift through the packages to find the best looking one, but you never know what's going to be on the underside of the packaging. Okay, now that we have them seasoned up and the bone fragments are removed, let's cut them into chunks, which will help the marinade dig in a little bit better. And the size I'm going for here are pieces around 1.5 inches to 2 inches. You don't want these things too big or too small. If they're too big, they will take forever to cook, and the outside might become a little bit too charred before the inside gets done. And if the pieces are too small, they could dry out and become tough and chewy before they take on any caramelization at all. And once you've got them all cut up and added to the mixing bowl, make sure to toss them together with the marinade so everything gets evenly coated. Alright, these are ready to go into the refrigerator now to marinate, and ideally you want to do this overnight. Now I had a little bit of a late start to this myself, so they're going to be in there maybe 3 or 4 hours today. Just do what you can on these. If you plan it out and you have 24 hours, perfect. If not, just do what you can. If you have an hour, you have an hour. They're still going to be good, so just do what you can. And in we go. And while that's in there, let's get our pickled carrots and daikon ready. To get started with this, let's make our pickling brine. Over low heat, combine 3 ounces each of white wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, and water. And to that, add 3/4 teaspoon of salt and a tablespoon of sugar. A lot of people like to use distilled white vinegar here, but I don't think that's very flavorful, so I'm using more flavorful vinegars in mine. So whisk this together, and we're only looking to dissolve the salt and sugar here, so keep the heat low. And while that's heating up, let's jump over to the cutting board and get our vegetables ready. And here we're going to be cutting up carrots and daikon radish into what's called a julienne julienne cut, and the dimensions of this cut are 1/8 by 1/8 by 1 to 2 inches, and the length depends on the particular vegetable you're cutting. So to cut these out with a knife, start by cutting diagonal slices 1/8 of an inch thick, stack a few of them up, and cut through the slices to make them 1/8 of an inch all the way through. And while this can be done very tediously with a knife, a mandolin slicer is much faster, of course. Just attach the right blades, turn the dial to the right setting, and let the machine do the work. I do want to point out though that if you want to use a slicer, be very careful with it. I would suggest to do what I'm doing here, and that's wear a cut resistant glove. The last thing you want to do is cut yourself, so if you're not using a glove, I would stop well before your hand gets close to the blade. And what we're going for here is 4 ounces each of the carrot and daikon, and once you have that, go ahead and pour the pickling brine into the bowl, nestle everything in, and let's get our sandwich spread ready. And we're going to make a spicy chili mayonnaise, so start by adding 8 ounces of mayonnaise to a mixing bowl, and then we're going to work in something called Sambal Oelek, which translates to mortar and pestle sauce, and it's a common spicy chili condiment used in Southeast Asian cuisines. More and more grocery stores are carrying it these days, but you can always find it at an Asian market if you have one of those nearby. So add 4 ounces of this to the mixing bowl, which makes an easy 2 parts mayo to 1 part chili paste ratio, and finish with the zest of 1 lime and a pinch of salt. Give everything a stir to combine and set it aside for the moment, and let's head outside and get the grill fired up. And just in case you've missed some of my previous videos, I'm going to use a charcoal chimney starter, and all you do with these things is flip it over, stuff the bottom with crumpled newspaper, or use those ad things from the entrance of the grocery store, flip the chimney back over, fill it up with coals, and light the paper up underneath, and this will get the coals going. And after 15 to 20 minutes, the coals will be lit, so toss them into the grill, and I'm only going to use one side here. It's good to do this just in case flare-ups get out of control. So place the grates back on, give the grill a good brushing, because we always want to start with a clean grill, and we're ready to put our meat on. And while you weren't looking, I skewered these things up, and I'm going to start things off by placing them directly over the coals. And yeah, cutting them up and skewering them is an extra step, but I think it creates a good surface browning effect doing it this way. So a few things to point out when grilling these things. First off, there was a fair amount of sugar in the marinade, which on the grill can burn very easily. And there's quite a bit of fat in this particular cut of meat, which will render out and inevitably produce some flare-ups. So don't walk away from these things and keep them moving. And while I'm using a charcoal grill here, and some of the coals are hotter than the others, all grills have hot spots, even the more expensive ones. So that's another reason to make sure to keep these things moving. You want to make sure to get these things charred and caramelized all the way around, but we don't want them turning into carbon. So keep an eye on them and don't walk away from them. Okay, we can see the flames shooting up here, and a little bit of that is okay, but don't be afraid to move a few to the side and rotate them out to make everything more manageable. That's part of the advantage of only using part of the grill here, and if you're going to use a propane grill, you might actually be able to set up zones of lower and higher heat and work with it that way. And I would give a time for this stuff, but grills vary in heat intensity, and certainly charcoals do too. These took about 20 minutes for me, so I would expect somewhere within that ballpark. So when they're well browned, pull them off the grill, and we're going to allow these things to rest for about 10 or 15 minutes before cutting into them. Okay, now that we have all of our sandwich fillings finished up, let's go over some bread options. And traditionally, banh mi sandwiches are made with baguette bread, but as a general rule, you want a sturdy bread that's going to have a little bite to it. I'm going to be using these small baguettes that are known as demi-guettes or demi-baguettes. And another good option, you could use these ciabatta breads. These have some sturdiness to them as well. Now I did find this other bread that's also labeled as baguette. It's got the scoring marks of baguette, but it is a little bit softer. So if you find something like this, maybe toss it in the oven for a couple minutes to crisp it up and it'll work just fine. So to crisp the bread up, place it directly into a 300-degree oven, and this will take about 5 or 10 minutes, and the meat's well rested now so we can slice into it. And we're going for thin slices here because this particular cut of meat does have some connective tissue, so larger chunks can be kind of tough. And once you've got 1 or 2 skewers sliced up, we can put this whole thing together. After slicing the bread open, spread some of the chili mayonnaise onto both sides and follow that up with some thin tomato slices on the bottom. And people do usually add cucumbers here too, but I can't stand cucumbers, so I'm leaving them out. Either way you want to do it, pile a whole bunch of meat on top, add some of the pickled vegetables from earlier, a few jalapeno slices, and finally some cilantro leaves. And that's your sandwich. And like I said earlier, if you haven't had one of these, go find a Vietnamese restaurant and get one. And afterwards you can come back and make this thing. But for now, we reached the end of the video, so I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.